So I am Dr. Rebecca Redwood. I'm a GP from CHINGFORD. The other doctors who have signed this deputation are Dr. Deepa Shah, a GP from Dalston, Dr. Lynn Jones, OBE, consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist from Penzance, Dr. Rosa Roberts, psychiatry core trainee from Bristol, and Dr. Honey Smith, a GP from Sheffield. Doctors all over the country are asking the North London Waste Authority to pause and review their plans to build a new incinerator in Edmonton, as air pollution and the climate emergency are preventable causes of disease and death. All facts stated here have references which are in my deputation document. Air pollution causes around 40,000 deaths per year in the UK. It has been linked in cancer, asthma, stroke and heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and changes linked to dementia. The health problems resulting from air pollution cost the UK more than £20 billion every year. Air pollution is also associated with increased rates of autism, preterm birth, and stillbirth. There is evidence that increased air pollution allows pathogens such as coronavirus to spread further. The incinerator will release ultra-fine particulate matter that cannot be filtered. According to the World Health Organization, for the very smallest particles, there's no safe threshold below which no damage to health is observed. There has been no modelling of the plumes of pollution from the incinerator and no health impact assessment conducted on the short or long-term exposure to the plumes. Air pollution affects deprived communities more, which makes existing health inequalities worse. Moving the waste into North London will produce additional carbon emissions and road congestion with its own negative effects on health. Dramatic improvements in health have been shown to occur when air pollution is reduced. The climate emergency is a public health emergency. Over the next 50 years, the proposed incinerator would produce as much CO2 pollution as all of London does in 2 years, 700,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. CO2 pollution lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, so the negative health effects of the climate disruption it causes will be felt far into the future. As doctors, we work daily to save lives. By making a decision to pause and review this incinerator, you will save more lives than we will in our entire careers. It's easy to clap for our NHS. We are asking you to actually support our NHS and support our key workers by pausing the incinerator and so reducing the rates of preventable death and disease, both now and far into the future. Thank you.
The decision to proceed with this waste management strategy was taken nearly a decade ago, and it was based on science at that time, which I believe is now outdated. And it's imperative that we look at current evidence and examine it and take on board this new evidence whilst you look at expanding the project. So I want to start by looking at the health of my residents in Edmonton, and to look at how they are very concerned what with COVID-19 and how it's impacting on the Black, Asian and minority communities. And they feel that with the death rate as it is, and the possibility of a larger incinerator, how that will impose on them and how it will expose their children to further health risks. There is scientific studies which provide evidence that there are very hazardous particles which are released from the incinerators, and it is generally recognised that smaller particles are more harmful to human health, unlike larger particles. And these can penetrate pulmonary tissue, enter the bloodstream and circulate throughout the body. There is over 90% of my community that lives near to the incinerators, which have unfortunately increased rates of respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses and hospitalised and because of that. The building of this larger incinerator would only worsen the air quality which is already in place. And given the health-related concerns, I urge NLWA to apply the precautionary principle over safety for this endeavour and to seek further evidence.
And as an Assembly member, I have consistently opposed energy from waste on the basis that incinerators undermine recycling and the circular economy, contribute to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and that London already has more incinerator capacity than it needs. We've seen the negative impact of increased incinerator capacity on recycling rates in the Western Riverside Waste Authority boroughs, where recycling has fallen each year since the Belvedere Energy from Waste plant in Bexley went into operation in 2012. On average, those four councils' recycling rates went down by nearly 4% from 2010 to 2016, putting 3 of them into the worst 6 councils for recycling in England. If you go back a step in the waste management process, we actually need to help boroughs reduce their arisings and cut the overall turnover of stuff. Now, the authority's decision to increase incineration capacity was based on predictions back in 2009 of an increase in the total generation of waste arisings for North London due to increasing population figures. But in reality, the 7 boroughs' actual arisings did not rise as expected and have been declining since 2015.
1 minute.
And by 2018-19, the 7 boroughs were actually producing about 150,000 tonnes less waste than the NLWA had predicted, and therefore about 75,000 tonnes less residual waste than predicted. This calls into question the initial rationale for building more incineration capacity. Increased incinerator capacity is incompatible with the need to increase recycling rates, boost the circular economy, and reduce overall waste arisings. And from the perspective of dealing with the coronavirus crisis and its as yet unquantified impact on our economy, it is only prudent to pause and reassess all the modelling and assumptions that led you to a solution that commits North London to producing increased levels of residual waste to keep this proposed incinerator running. Thank you.
These things take a long time to plan. And I think it's unfortunate that there's a suggestion that since 2009, we have not, as a collective group of boroughs, been constantly reflecting on changes, constantly reflecting on the science, constantly reflecting on new evidence, constantly reflecting on the data. We have been doing all of that. And when in 2013 we paused the previous project at great risk to the authority and the boroughs because we didn't yet know where we were going to head with regard to an alternative solution, we made some big decisions then and there, and we have followed through that path and all along constantly reflecting on the evidence, the science, the data, to ensure that what we were embarking on was the right solutions for the right reasons for where we were heading as North London. So, I do think it's unfortunate that people constantly suggest that we haven't reflected, we haven't taken on board stuff, when all along we have been. And at some point, and this is about leadership, Caroline, I'm afraid, at some point you do have to make a decision and you do have to follow it through.
I just want to stress a few points about this, but endorse pretty much what they said. The area of overcapacity I want just to look at very carefully, which is, in view of the London's plan, 65%, as I understand it, recycling target for 2030, the planned incinerator now looks like it's something in the order of 3 times larger than what appears to be North London's needs. Now, those are the independent review that took place, so I'll be interested to see what the views of that are. And 30% larger than the current incinerator, the waste generation has been falling. So there are questions as to whether or not, given the time this has been in proposal, and you said earlier on, you put the dates up, it's a matter of concern, I think, for a lot of people that this will be bigger, larger, and be bringing in waste from other areas to burn, which isn't necessarily linked or part of what is necessary for North London. The second area I want to draw out on this is the air pollution point, because obviously my constituency sits under the predominant wind pattern for that incinerator. And Dr. Redwood, who is from the constituency, made this point about the ultrafine particulate matter that won't be filtered from the air and therefore will be linked to higher vulnerability to infectious diseases. It has to be said also that in the area most hit by this is a much older population who are therefore more vulnerable, and that's why Dr. Redwood raised the issue about the increased vulnerability to things like COVID. And the other bit was the value for money. And I would therefore ask as a request that you undertake a value for money review at this particular point, so that everybody can see whether or not this represents good value for money at this particular time, given all the financial constraints and everything else and the requirements, as I said, to make sure that we have as clean an atmosphere as possible based against the capacity of the incinerator. And then there's one other area, which is parts of the areas that will be affected by this do not appear to have been consulted. And I would like to have seen a greater level of consultation on that. Many parts of this constituency and others didn't get consultation. I'd be grateful if that could therefore be changed, and therefore full consultation be got rid of. I'm not going to, as I said earlier on, repeat what the others have said. I endorse what they said, and that's the end of my evidence.
Thank you, Ian. If I could just perhaps ask you a favour. Yeah. I mean, if we're really serious about improving recycling and reducing the residual waste in North London, then we as an authority need parliamentarians to get the legislation around packaging and plastics enacted. You know, Parliament has been sitting on that now for a couple of years. That could be easily done, and that would make a huge difference. And you could give local government the powers to make recycling compulsory.
Well, look, I'll do a little deal with you. I'll get on to those cases and I'll talk to the Secretaries of State and I'll represent your opinions to them quite happily. If you give me a value for money review of this particular incinerator to prove your case against what has been raised today, I would be very happy for you to do the value for money, for us to therefore see finally once and for all whether there is a serious and genuine case for this incinerator, because I get the sense this incinerator was the kind of decision that was made for a time that has now changed dramatically. So if you do that, I'll happily work with you on the other things that you want us to do as well.
Our project, our programme is constantly being scrutinised around its value for money, constantly. You know, and that is part of taking a piece of national infrastructure. Again, I repeat this. This isn't just North London. This isn't just a regional piece of infrastructure. This is national infrastructure. And just like some of the projects perhaps you are more familiar with from a national perspective, Heathrow and such like, Ian, you know, we go through similar sorts of scrutiny and process with regard to the costs, the science, the technology, et cetera, going forward. So as I said at the start, Ian, okay, we'll reflect on all the questions that we haven't answered from our deputations, and we'll put up a response to all of those.
The website actually says residual waste may inevitably contain material which in theory could be recycled. Second question, is recycled waste separated from the residual waste at the new resource recovery facility? I thought it was, but it's not. It's up to us householders and businesses to do the separation. So we're burning and plan to burn what can be recycled for the next half century. We wonder what next generations will say about that. So a question is about, are you convinced it's safe? The tide is turning on incineration as a means of managing waste beyond the small quantity of residual waste that cannot currently be recycled. The Deputy Mayor of London has written, I've been clear that London is facing a climate emergency and does not need more energy from waste incinerators. Dr. Alan Whitehead, MP, Shadow Minister for Energy and the Green New Deal, said we need to understand why, in an era of zero carbon ambitions, the idea of granting permission for such an enormous plant to deal with our waste is still being contemplated.
to suggest that we have not been working hard to develop the best solution for North London for the next 20 years is incredibly disingenuous. But at some point, someone has to show some leadership, Vicky, and I'm proud of the members of the authority that are showing that leadership, having to make difficult decisions, but for the right reasons. And yeah, we are doing what we can on a whole range of different environmental agendas and issues.
Clearly, Councillor Loakes, we have a very different opinion here. It doesn't feel like you're prepared to listen to other opinions. Now, first and foremostly, I want to talk about the lack of democratic input here. Residents have not been consulted on this in half a decade, and actually only 2 of 7 boroughs in North London have. So the rest of us haven't actually been given a voice at all. And even for those residents that you did consult, the plans have changed really considerably. And most notably is the burning of waste from outside of North London. Now, for me, this is a real worry. It means that waste has to be shipped into this site from much, much further afield to ensure that the facility will operate at full capacity. So that means more transport pollution and further releases of CO2, as well as adding further congestion to our roads. And I note yourself, you mentioned the pollution from the A406. Well, it's not going to improve with your lorries charging down it all the time, is it? Councillor Loakes, I'm not sure if you've ever seen images of children's lungs when they've inhaled those particulate matter. Now, I did see images of my son's lungs, and it's really, really relevant because I live just over the border from Edmonton in Tottenham, in an area where residents have had no idea that this project is taking place right under their noses. So on the subject of carbon capture process, we haven't seen any data on this. So for me, I like to act on fact. And if you want me to weigh up the pros and cons of this situation, I haven't seen that data. So it leads me to presume that the data that you have isn't positive. Now, I'm really happy for you to prove me wrong on that, but I would really, really urge you, and I think others have urged as well, that we must see that data. Now, I've heard you talk a lot about the positives of this process, but bluntly, I think the ship has sailed for this. The time for incinerating waste for energy has really, really passed. We are simply not producing as much as when your plans were first designed. And the size, the simple size of this incinerator will surely produce more CO2 for London than anything else. So please, for the many reasons that I and every other person here has outlined today, we are simply asking you to pause and then look at some reasonable alternatives.
Thank you, Tammy. There's a saying, with power comes responsibility, Tammy, and you've just perfectly articulated to me why potentially you will never be in power. You have to take ownership and take responsibility for your decisions, and that's what we are doing on the North London Waste Authority. So thank you for your questions today. As I said, any that we haven't answered already will be posted on the NLWA's website. Please, as a parting gesture, start taking some responsibility for your own decisions.
Councillor Loakes, I am going to come back to you on that, please. You are extraordinarily rude.
Councillor Pearson has set out his question very clearly. In the light of changes in recycling habits and technology, changes in packaging, changes in consumption, the impact of COVID-19 on lifestyles, and the ever greater concern of the effects of climate change, will the authority reassess the proposals to construct the Edmonton Incinerator, reassess whether it will remain relevant for the 40 years of its planned life, and whether its $1.2 billion cost remains the optimal solution as it seemed when the project was planned nearly 10 years ago. It's really important to us that you change something at this meeting. We need something to change. It may be boring to you that people keep coming at you with the same questions and you keep having to give the answers, but it's because they're worried and because they won't be brushed off. You can see there are 8 other deputations. So much has changed since you all thought this was a good idea. If you want to show you how you've taken on board your reflections over the last 10 years, do the pause and review and show us and reassure us why this would be a good idea to go ahead. This particular thing, this Edmonton incinerator, is under your control. And if it's under your control, then it's up to you to do something about it so that when we look at future generations, they don't look back on this and see that it's where you have failed us. I'm sorry you're looking away and other things are more important, but this is incredibly important to us. Thank you.
When you are making your decision today, and I address this to all of you members, you have a duty to take all relevant considerations into account and to disregard irrelevant ones. If you fail to do that, your decision will be open to challenge on grounds of unreasonableness. And Councillor Loakes, I would now like to just come back to a couple of comments that you made, answers to previous people. You talked a lot about leadership, about power and responsibility. Your authority has no strategic waste plan. Your responsibility is to make sure there is one. You're going to go ahead with a massive, oversized project without any strategy. And you know now that all of the numbers and all of the strategies that you relied on to get your planning application through that, that process was based on what is now rubbished calculations. Waste, residual waste, is going down, not up. The facts are all there, and transparency is all important. So you haven't provided the leadership. You've left the authority without a strategic plan, and I think it's time you resign, quite frankly.
The alternatives. We have looked at the alternatives countless times, and it keeps coming back to the offer that we currently have on the table, the project that we currently have on the table as being the best solution going forward with what we know now. And at some point, you have to make a decision on what you know. Please, though, be in no doubt just how much time, effort, scrutiny that has been put into getting us to where we are today. Doing nothing, pausing, is simply not an option. Not an option.